So, we're going to hear about the truth about leftist insanity on college campuses. Take it away, Ben.
Mr. Shapiro.
Excuse me, Mr. Shapiro.
It's an honor to testify. It's an honor to testify before you here today. The reason that I'm with you is that I speak on dozens of college campuses every year, so I have some firsthand experience with the anti-First Amendment activities that have been taking place on the college campuses. I've encountered.
Keep in mind, by anti-First Amendment activities, he means individual students protesting someone giving a message they dislike. Now, there have been some protesters who have gone to extremes I disagree with. If you're jumping on stage or shouting down and not letting them give their message, depending on the person, that may be extreme. But what he is referring to is the broader protest message of simply standing outside peacefully with signs, maybe chanting, while they go on inside. Actually, I will revise what I said earlier. No, when someone is preaching hate, drown them out, shout them down. That's not violating their First Amendment. No institution is preventing them from spreading their message. But individuals have a right to respond. And yes, some protest organizations could be considered an organization, but they're not an agent of the government. And private institutions always have the ability to shut down speech they disagree with. That's why they have terms of service. Don't like it, don't sign it. Build your own program. How's Gab doing?
Anti-free speech measures, administrative cowardice, even physical violence at campuses ranging from California State University at Los Angeles to University of Wisconsin at Madison, which is driving the legislation that Ms. Demings was talking about, to Penn State University to UC Berkeley, and I am not alone. In order to understand what's been going on at some of our college campuses, it's necessary to explore the ideology that provides the impetus for a lot of the protesters who violently obstruct events, pull fire alarms, assault professors and even other students, and the impetus for administrators who all too often humor these protesters. Free speech is under assault because of a three-step argument made by the advocates and justifiers of violence. The first step is they say that the validity or invalidity of an argument can be judged solely by the ethnic, sexual, racial, or cultural identity of the person making the argument.
Absolutely not. That is not a leftist argument. We are willing to listen to anyone of any ethnic, racial, religious background, whatever. We judge your argument on the merits of it, but you like to trot out minorities who agree with your arguments, so that lets you say that we are silencing black people or gay people or whatever from speaking. It's not what we're doing. We're silencing fascists.
The second step is that they claim those who say otherwise are engaging in what they call verbal violence. And the final step is they conclude that physical violence is sometimes justified in order to stop such verbal violence. So let's examine each of these three steps in turn. First,
I officially disavow any and all actual political violence.
The philosophy of intersectionality. This philosophy now dominates college campuses as well as a large segment, unfortunately, of today's Democratic Party, and suggests that straight white Americans are inherently the beneficiaries of white privilege and therefore cannot speak on certain policies, since they...
Ben! I agreed with the first part. Straight white people do benefit from privilege. That doesn't mean they can't speak on issues. They just have to make sure not to speak over people with more relevant experience and not to try to drive out those voices, which is what you're trying to do.
They've not experienced what it's like to be black or Hispanic or gay or transgender or a woman. This philosophy ranks the value of a view not based on the logic or merit of the view, but on the level of victimization in American society experienced by the person espousing the view. Therefore, if you're an LGBT black woman, your view of American society is automatically more valuable than that of a straight white male.
Only when it relates to the issues relating to LGBT black women. Like, I will listen all day long to a lesbian black person about issues related to lesbian black women. But they're not going to have a lot to say about, say, straight Latino men. There's going to be some overlap, certainly, but it's not going to be as useful as, say, a straight Latino man. So do you see why these spaces tend to downplay white voices because of our history of taking over those spaces? Of course he does. He's just a grifter.
Next step in the logic is obvious. If a straight white male, or anybody else who ranks lower on the victimhood scale, says something contrary to the viewpoint of the higher-ranking intersectionality identity, that person has engaged
I love that conservatives' adoration for hierarchy extends to the point that they have envisioned a hierarchy of racism. Because that's what this is. This is, you are more affected by racism or whatever bigotry, so your voice has more weight than mine because I'm higher up on the scale. And there's no such thing. A straight Latino man is oppressed just as a gay black woman and a trans Asian non-binary person. They're all oppressed, some to greater and lesser degrees, but there's still oppression there. And we need to look at the intersections of those oppressions and how we can change each of them individually to help all of them.
Engage in a microaggression. As NYU social psychologist Jonathan Haidt writes, microaggressions are small actions or word choices that seem on their face to have no malicious intent, but that are thought of as a kind of violence nonetheless. You don't have to actively say anything insulting to microaggress. Somebody merely needs to take offense. If, for example, you say that society ought to be colorblind, you're microaggressing certain identity groups who have been victimized by a non-colorblind society. Note,
oftentimes, people advocating for a colorblind society are advocating for a society which ignores race but leaves the existing structures in place, which doesn't do anything for people who don't have much power in place. Like, if you're already poor and they remove the pressure from being black, we do somehow wave a magic wand and create a world where there's no difference in race. We just completely eliminate racism. Poof, it's gone, like when Obama was elected. Then they would still have the oppression of being poor and whatever else they may be oppressed by. This is why advocating for a race-blind society at this stage is not good. I agree that we should move towards a race-blind society, a colorblind society. But if we just instituted that now, it would not help because they would still be poor.
microaggressions, as the name suggests, are not merely insults. They are aggressions. They are the equivalent to physical violence. Just 2 weeks ago, psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett of Northeastern University published an essay in the New York Times suggesting that words should be seen as physical.
This is interesting because violence is considered anything that causes harm, and so by that, a microaggression does cause harm, even if it's a small amount, but it's more that it goes to reinforce that societal position.
Physical violence because they can cause stress, and stress causes physical harm. Thus, Feldman suggested it is reasonable, scientifically speaking, to ban or restrict speech you do not like at your school. This is both inane and dangerous. That's because it leads to the final logical step. Words you don't like deserve to be fought physically. When I spoke at California State University at LA, one professor threatened students who sponsored me by offering to fight them. He then posted a slogan on the door of his office stating, "The best response to microaggression is macroaggression." As Haidt writes, this is why the idea that speech is violence is so dangerous. It tells the members of a generation already beset by anxiety and depression that the world is a far more violent and threatening place than it really is. It tells them that words, ideas, speakers can literally kill them. Even worse, at a time of rapid...
Words cannot literally kill someone, but they can create a situation where someone gets hurt or killed. I mean, there's a reason why we credit Hitler with killing 6 million Jews and the other 6 million or so other minorities that were killed. Also, Ben Shapiro, weren't you in the manifesto of at least one mass shooter? See, it was so long ago, hard to say, but, yeah. Words are violence. Use them wisely.
Rapidly rising political polarization in the United States, it helps a small subset of that generation justify political violence. Indeed, protesters all too often engage in physically violent disruption when they believe their identity group is under verbal attack by someone, usually conservative, but not always. Not only do some administrators look the other way, at Middlebury College, Cal State LA, Berkeley, Evergreen, actual crimes were committed and almost nobody has been arrested. But they actively forbid events from moving forward, creating a heckler's veto. The notion that if you are physically violent enough, you can get administrators to kowtow to you, to bow before you, by canceling an event you disagree with altogether. All of this.
Yes, if someone wants to spread hate, and you can get that event canceled by any means necessary without causing more harm than the presentation would, do so. Yes.
Destroys free speech. But just as importantly, it turns students into snowflakes, craven and pathetic, looking for an excuse to be offended so they can earn points in the intersectionality Olympics and then use those points as a club.
I won't deny that there are definitely some college students who are looking for reasons to be offended. There are some people all over the fucking world on social media and places like that that are looking for reasons to be offended. But the majority of people have an issue with what is going to be said and want to prevent it from being said. But if Ben can just lump all of them together as the same group, then he can dismiss them and doesn't have to listen to real argument.
Club with which to beat opponents. A healthy nation requires an emotionally and intellectually vigorous population ready to engage in open debate at all times. Shielding college students from opposing viewpoints makes them simultaneously weaker and more dangerous. We must fight that process at every step. And that begins by acknowledging that whatever we think about America and where we stand, we must agree on this fundamental principle. All of our views should be judged on their merits, not on the color or sex or sexual orientation of the speaker, and those views should never be banned on the grounds that they offend someone. Thanks so much.
I agree. Our arguments should be based on the merits of the argument and should ignore the race, sex, gender, whatever of the person. That is not the identity politics I agree with. Identity politics are such that we take someone's identity into account when crafting the message and things like that to more personalize a message or a bill or whatever. But I agree, we should not disregard someone based solely on their identity.
Mr. Shapiro.
Which is why Candace Owens is not the advocate they think she is.
Shapiro. You an agitator?
Not as far as I'm aware. So I think that some of what's been said does mini-skirt the debate. Mr. Krishnamurthy, I got it right. When you were talking about the Wisconsin law, I believe that law was brought up in direct counter to what happened, and it was people talked about it on the floor of the legislature. In direct counter to what happened when I spoke at University of Wisconsin at Madison, where you had a bunch of protesters who stood in front of the stage and obstructed the stage, and then refused to leave. And when I asked the police would they remove the protesters at a certain, they've been going for 15 minutes. By the way, personally, two things, just to preface. I have no problem whatsoever with people protesting my speeches. I do have a problem with people who won't actually let me speak. And number two, as far as all the talk about white supremacy.
Then you have an issue with protesters. I mean, fair enough. It's totally fair to be upset at protesters who are preventing you from speaking. But don't try to say you have no issue with protesters, but...
Supremacy, I can speak...
And to be clear, if there are ever right-wing protesters at an event, I fully support their right to protest. They're just wrong.
From experience, Mr. Lawrence, your organization named me the #1 target of anti-Semitism online last year. So I have a trophy at my house that says #1 hated Jew in America. So I'm totally familiar with the level of vitriol that's become common in our politics. But one of the things that's a problem, and
it's funny because the right is anti-Semitic.
And I think we have to be careful about is when we say leave it to the administrators, and then the administrators do what they did at UW, which is the police. I said to the police, "Will you remove these protesters?" And the police said, "We have been told by the administration that if we remove the protesters, we are to shut down the event entirely. So we can't remove the protesters." We literally had to wait until they just got tired and walked out, basically. When that's the response of the administration, shouldn't there be some sort of repercussion for that? Because what I'm seeing is a heckler's veto that's taking place on campus. What I'm seeing is people who are not engaging in...
Sorry, I'm going to back up. I forget what he was even talking about.
We have been told by the administration that if we remove the protesters...
Right, so if we remove the protesters and this event ends, based fucking administrator. Because that is an administrator who probably didn't want Ben on the premises, but was overruled or had some other issue. So he saw an opportunity and he took it. Because any platform holder has the right to withdraw your use of that platform, as long as it's privately owned. Berkeley may not be privately owned because I believe it's a public college. But even so, there are private property laws that come into that. The president of the college is usually considered to have that authority for most things. So platforms can choose to not let you on there as long as they're privately held. Nationalize Twitter, Ben. Do it. Do it.
We are to shut down the event entirely. So we can't remove the protesters. We literally had to wait until they just got tired and walked out, basically. When that's the response of the administration, Shouldn't there be some sort of repercussion for that? Because what I'm seeing is a heckler's veto that's taking place on campus. What I'm seeing is people who are not engaging in free speech designed to enrich the debate, but in order to shut down the debate. And there have to be some sort of ramification.
Because you don't have anything to say. We know what you're going to argue, Ben. That's why they want to shut you down.
For people who are actually committing trespass. I mean, this is not a question of free, everyone is trying to focus in on this term hate crime and hate speech. But the important part of those phrases is not the first word. It's speech versus crime. So if there's a crime that's being committed, we're all in agreement. If somebody commits a crime and they're speaking.
Hate speech is something I'm a little iffy on because I'm not comfortable with the government deciding what is and isn't accepted speech, because you can easily get hard repression as a result of that. That said, that doesn't mean that we can't have societally accepted rules about speech, which we do. In most places, if you say fuck, shit, cunt, damn, hell, ass, you'll probably get some funny looks. And there are some places where that is absolutely, you can't do that. And there are worse words that I can't even say on these platforms that are societally decided as bad as well. But this is what we're referring to. We're not referring to a legal action being taken against you. We're referring to a social action taken against you. Those are two different things, but conservatives love to conflate the two.
Speaking of an imminent threat to somebody, of course that's a crime. But that has very little to do with the hate and a lot more to do with the crime as to whether that's prosecuted, because hate speech is not prosecutable, nor should it be policed by the campus. So the fact is that what we are seeing is a conflation between speech and active attempts to obstruct in order to promote the obstruction by some administrators on a few college campuses.
I highly doubt they were actually preventing you from speaking, Ben. They were just speaking over you. That's their right. They have the right to speak, and if the crowd just lets them peacefully do that, then that is their right. You could have gotten on stage and tried to speak over them. Use your better rhetoric, Ben. You love chewing up college students.
Can you speak to how time, manner, and place restrictions are being abused?
So most obviously, UC Berkeley did that with Ann Coulter, where they kept moving around her room and they kept saying they didn't have rooms available. They said the same thing to me a week ago. There was some public outcry, and now they're offering some rooms, which I hope that event goes forward. It's not rare. They do this a lot. A private university that did it was DePaul University. I was threatened with arrest if I set foot on campus. I actually showed up there, and a security guard told me, I asked him, if I move 6 inches forward, are you going to arrest me? And he said yes, and he had the sheriff of Cook County behind him. So this is, it's become a cover for...
If DePaul University is a private institution, then that is well within their rights. He just said it was a private university. That's within their rights. They have the right to refuse entry to anyone. Sorry, Ben, that's the rules of private ownership.
Campus. I actually showed up there, and a security guard told me, I asked him, if I move 6 inches forward, are you going to arrest me? And he said yes, and he had the sheriff of Cook County behind him. So this is, it's become a cover for ideological discrimination, because if Ta-Nehisi Coates wants to speak on these campuses, there's not going to be any problem. The administrators will make certain that time, place, and manner restrictions don't get in the way. And this is why I say...
So he doesn't know that. He doesn't know necessarily that Ta-Nehisi Coates won't also get a runaround, because the reason why they have to shuffle things around is they may not be well organized, or they may have a bunch of other things going on. He just assumes that getting the administrative runaround is a deliberate action.
Saying that the discretion of administrators is wonderful is all well and good, except that they very often are attempting to achieve a particular political end by using means that are normally legitimate, and that's definitely...
Notice how Ben only objects to administrators showing political bias when it's against him. But if an administrator chose to go out of their way to get Ben Shapiro on his campus, he would view it as a righteous crusader fighting for what he believed in. Just a funny little coincidence there.
definitely a dangerous thing. If you don't mind, I have a quick note on something that I think it was Mr. Lawrence was saying earlier about the damage that's done to students by various things that happen on campus, by threats of violence and this sort of thing. And obviously, everyone, I think, agrees that what happened to Taylor is unacceptable. But one of the things that I think should also be pointed out is we have a lot of other students in the crowd and administrators who spend an enormous amount of time pushing stuff like white privilege means that you must accept that you are subordinate in terms of your view because of identity. This also has some lasting damage.
That's not what white privilege means. Accepting white privilege means that you may not have experienced the things that those without that privilege have experienced. It's that simple, Ben.
With regard to First Amendment exercise and with regard to how people perceive the freedom of the country. And I understand that this is universally held belief among university educators that we have to accept the guilt of particular races or particular sexual orientations for discrimination that's happened in the past. But when you teach a bunch of 18 and 19-year-old people this, you shouldn't be surprised when, number one, they go into hiding with their viewpoint, or number two, they become frustrated. It's an absurdity to suggest that you can tell people that their viewpoints are out of line because of their identity. At the same time, you're telling other people that their viewpoints are completely in line because of their identity, and that any assault on their senses must be protected or prevented at any cost.
Well, I would just like to point out in closing that the group.
No one is trying to prevent offenses or microaggressions at any cost. We're trying to get people to recognize them so that they'll stop on their own. I guess we are trying to prevent them, but we're not trying to legislate it. We're just trying to bring attention to it so that people understand what's going on. Because I believe fundamentally most people are good people. I think that this is borne out in data, and it's certainly borne out in my experience. There are bad people, but they are way outnumbered by good people. And so I think if we show people how these behaviors can do harm, that they will correct their behavior.
Young Americans for Liberty, that is handing out constitutions on campuses all across the country, has changed free speech restrictions on 25 campuses just by handing out this document, not by setting fires because they didn't like the speaker or throwing rocks through windows, but by handing out this Constitution. And I am inspired that there are young people who are inspired by this document, and it should never be illegal to hand out this document.
Well said.
Yeah, I think the world would be a better place if everyone just had a Constitution just issued to them monthly, because eventually they'd read it.
Mr. Massey, real quick, Ms. Strawson, is Mr. Shapiro right? Are most of the anti-speech activities going on campuses targeted towards conservatives and libertarians?
Certainly the well-publicized ones have been, and I can't speak for campuses across the country, but I go back to an opening point that I made, which was best summarized in the title of a book by Nat Hentoff.
But I just wanted to answer. I can't. We'll come back to that. But I just wanted to respond to Mr. Shapiro's point. I mean, that's my understanding as well, and I'll be.
Those are the well-publicized incidents, and it would be consistent with what surveys show about the prevailing beliefs on campus, that the majority of students are on the liberal end of the political spectrum. The majority of faculty members are on the liberal end.
I find that shocking.
Education has a well-known leftist bias.
Spectrum, so they would be more likely to be offended by
Professor Raskin, you're
conservative
smiling.
speakers.
You find that shocking too, don't you?
Now, it's interesting, Mr. Shapiro, you talked about white privilege. And just this week, I had a conversation with Rachel Lazar, who's done some work, a Jewish American woman who's done some work on this area, as well as having extensive conversations with Dr. Greg Parks of Wake Forest University, who's also talked quite a bit about critical race theory. And it's my understanding that white privilege is not telling individuals that they cannot speak, but it is a term for societal privilege that individuals have as a benefit of their white skin. And I don't think that, and I think universities would be remiss to then say that because you're white, you're not allowed to say anything that's critical of white people. I didn't know that white privilege actually went into that sphere. My understanding is it's just, and the issue is that white privilege makes people uncomfortable to talk about the societal privilege that they have.
Well,
Hello, base department? Yeah, we have an excess of basedness here. Yeah, that was good. Very nice takedown of everything Ben Shapiro just rattled on about white privilege.
to me, what I say on campuses all the time is if you want to cite instances of racism that we can all find and fight together, that's something that I am more than willing to stand next to you and fight, because that's obviously stuff that we should fight together. But when you just say that there is a white privilege out there in the ether and that by dint of birth your skin color generates for you an advantage, what you're really saying to people is that your view.
What Ben objects to is the aesthetics of racism. He couldn't give two shits less about actually being racist or actual racist actions, as long as they don't say the N-word or call them a monkey or whatever other racial term or whatever other aesthetically racist thing he objects to.
Is less valuable because you have not experienced what I've experienced. And that is an identity argument, that's a character argument, that's not a rational political argument.
Not to mention the other examples of systemic racism, like two people with similar criminal backgrounds, similar employment backgrounds, and identical credit scores, but one's black and one's white, so they'll get two different quotes on buying a car or buying a house.
It can actually be taken on in any way. It's more of a cudgel and a club than it is an attempt to open a discussion.
Well, I think it's a demonstrable evidence that through society's demographics that being white has societal privileges that being black does not. But
we can talk about how that manifests, because that's
I'm
more
also
interesting,
interested in what you just said now, is that you would stand next to anyone who has this. So, Mr. Shapiro, my question to you is, for Ms. Dunston, the tying the noose around the campus and writing messages that target African-American young students, would you consider that hate speech, and then would you stand next to her and fight for her?
As I say,
against that?
this is the first I'm hearing about it, honestly, but...
Really?
Yeah, but from hearing about it, maybe because it's local, I mean, I'm from LA. But in any case, I'm more than happy to stand alongside her and fight whatever group was responsible for this. Not only more than happy, I mean, you're talking about the alt-right. Again, I was the #1 target of anti-Semitic harassment from the alt-right last year.
Thank you.
I'm more than happy to do all that. And I think there's one more distinction that has to be made. When we talk about cases like Taylor's, they're horrific, and the administration...
He gets shit from the alt-right because he's a Zionist. But it has to be stated that Ben Shapiro is one of the leading entryways into the alt-right.
...is siding with Taylor. Okay, the administration is doing the right thing by Taylor, or trying to do the right thing by Taylor, as they should be. And I think that we need to make a distinction between cases where the administration is actively participating in the suppression of speech and cases in which the administration is trying to do the right thing in order to punish people for application of crime.
Gentlemen.
Oh, that was abrupt. Ben Shapiro knows nothing about what leftists want and loves to conflate legal action with social action. And they're two different things, unfortunately, for him. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you liked it, like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you. See you next time.